Welcome to Leading Minds Revealed, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on how today's top leaders harness the power of mindfulness to conquer the fast-paced, ever-changing world of business. In each episode, we sit down with C-suite executives and leaders who share their strategies for navigating rapid change with skill and clarity. Join us as we uncover the transformative mindsets that drive extraordinary leadership. These insights aren't found in business books, and they'll revolutionize the way you lead. And now, here's your host, Michael Apollo.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Leading Minds Revealed. In this episode, we'll explore what it takes to lead effectively across cultures in today's rapidly changing world. You'll hear insights on the unique challenges and opportunities of multicultural leadership, how leaders can adapt to cultural nuances when building international teams and scaling globally, the role of mentorship, resilience, and cultural fluidity in shaping authentic leadership, and why the rise of AI and healthcare technology requires leaders to balance innovation with cultural and ethical considerations. My guest today brings a wealth of experience at the intersection of healthcare, technology, and global expansion. She has worked across the Middle East, Europe, and North America, guiding organizations through acquisitions, international market entry, and cross-cultural integration. Currently, she plays a pivotal role at League, where she supports its expansion into the UK, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE while navigating the evolving landscape of healthcare tech and AI. With that, let's welcome my guest, Lamiaa Soliman. Welcome to the show, Lamiaa.
Thank you, Michael. What an introduction. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. We were just chatting, and you literally just essentially came off the plane back from Saudi Arabia, and you shared that it's just changed so much that you've been there. You know, it's been a little bit of a while since you've been there. Um, I'm just curious, what changes have you noticed? And you also mentioned that there's a certain way to engage there in business and in communications. Tell me more.
Yeah, so Saudi Arabia is a dear place for me. I mentioned to you, I think, once that I grew up there. I spent 14 years of my life there as a child. So I say my formative period has been shaped in Saudi. And I left that in almost 2003. So it's a very, very different place at the moment. It was a place when I left it where women were not very present in the workplace. Women were not allowed to drive. It had not opened up in a business perspective in the same way that it has in recent years. And even when I was living in Dubai previously and going to Saudi for some meetings here and there, again, things were slowly opening up, but definitely nothing like what I experienced in my Riyadh trip, 10 days ago. I had to unlearn a lot of my sort of thoughts on the country, and sitting in meetings where women were the majority in the meeting, very well educated, lots of Western education, lots of technical education. We were sitting across from women who are engineers and data scientists, fully covered up and having very technical conversations. So again, it works against the stereotypes that a lot of the media portrays around a woman who may be veiled or wearing a black garment or so, being uneducated or outside of the public spaces. So really, for me as an Arab, there was an unlearning process there of saying, "Oh wow, there's real fast change happening on the ground."
Mm. Yeah, it's fast change happening on the ground is almost like a ubiquitous term across technology, across industries. There's just so much changing right now. And, what do you see as the biggest challenge leaders face, when working across different cultures today?
I think it's about matching the pace of change of technology, especially with the cultural nuances of any region or country. And that I think it differs sector by sector. So whereas in social media, for example, platforms, the rollout of those globally has happened quite fast. In other spaces, it has not happened in the same way. Healthcare is a place where that is very culturally sensitive. It's very personal to the individual. It's considered one of the key sort of sovereign areas that governments are very particular about in terms of what happens to patient data, how is their population health data managed and assessed. And so the willingness to adopt international technologies and run with it is not necessarily the same way as it is in other spaces. So I think my approach is in looking at that international expansion is to say, okay, let's look at it as a two-pronged approach, top down and bottom up. And you really have to spend a lot of time listening to what are the stakeholders asking for on the ground, what is the citizen or patient wanting, and what can the technology do, and how can it be customized into that local setting. I experienced this firsthand also in my previous company that was a mental health tech company. Again, mental health is a very, very nuanced space. It's a burden on any government at the moment. It is there's rising mental health crisis across all parts of the world, but there's definitely lots of nuance around how to handle it. For example, in a lot of the global South countries, even saying mental health or employee assistance programs was not possible. You had to say well-being. Well-being signals a more positive aura overall, and it doesn't say that there is a problem with the individual or the organization. And so learning how to, the nomenclature around industries, around countries, and what are the different comfort levels of these countries in terms of adopting technologies is very important. It's There's a lot, in a Western context, and especially out of Silicon Valley, there is sort of speed at the expense of everything, and technology ramps up very quickly. And there's this idea that we're going out with rolling out technology, and everybody will catch up. The regulators, countries, whatnot. I think in certain parts of the world and in certain spaces, that doesn't hold in the same way. And it kind of success for me is about kind of slowing down to understand more around the local context in order to be able to accomplish milestones on the ground.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, I think there's this acknowledgement right now around something called human-centered design, where you really need to understand who the person is that's going to be using your product, your technology, your service, and what are their explicit needs, and where do they interact, where do they look for these offerings, for example. And it seems like almost when you're going cross borders, that that type of anthropological view, this human-centered design approach needs to sort of amp up, and cultural nuance, really understanding the cultural nuances is part of that. And so, you know, from your experience, why do some leaders perhaps underestimate cultural nuance? It seems like this is something that's very, very important from your perspective, and from the work that you do, clearly it's incredibly important and needed. Um, but why would some leaders sort of underestimate that, even in markets that may look familiar, like North America and the UK?
I think that comes down to sometimes we're all speaking the same language, and English as a language has become the default business language across many parts of the world. So you'll be sitting in a meeting in the Middle East or in Mexico or in parts of Europe, and you'll be conducting the meeting predominantly in English because of the number of different stakeholders around the table. And I think the tricky part is you think we're speaking the same language, but we're really saying very different things. And it's about trying to understand what words mean, what the context behind the sentences and what's being said at the table, what's not being said at the table. What does this mean to different cultures? And what does that mean in terms of expectations around timelines to deployment or adoption of solutions, answering to the pain points experienced in a certain country or in a certain client in a certain place. So I think it's that you have to slow down to understand that yes, there's no translator here and we're speaking the same language, but really the words means things that are very different. And also sometimes realizing that the people you are contracting with or the stakeholders at the table, your product or solution is not necessarily touching them directly. And so it's also a question of, are you speaking to the wider audience and to the underlying beneficiaries of that offering? And as you're saying, this idea of human-centered design is at the key of that. And in my opinion, in healthcare, is very, very important. And government stakeholders are always focused on this. Where is the patient voice? Where is the community factor? How is care delivered in the community? Who are the decision makers in the family? In the Middle East, for example, a lot of time with elderly parents, the key decision makers are actually not the individuals or the elders themselves. It's their eldest sibling, and understanding that dynamic in terms of even offering a patient portal or an app to communicate things like test results and next best action. You may need to be involving a wider family audience as opposed to the patient only, which in a UK or North American setting is not really heard of. My husband is a doctor himself, and sometimes, and he's of an Egyptian background too. And sometimes it takes him a while to understand that, this context, because he's like, my duty is to the patient. I don't need to be communicating to the broader family or so. And I say, again, it depends on the cultural context that you're in.
I'd love to get really practical here and dive into and unpack that a little bit more around like how do you identify that cultural nuance? How does a leader or an organization go and gain a greater understanding of the markets, the people, the way that they make decisions, the way they're thinking about certain concepts like mental health and versus well-being, and where mental health perhaps is highly valence in terms of stigma, and so therefore you need to approach it in a bit of a different way. Um, you know, I know League, for example, and I've been privy to its evolution, meeting the founder and CEO, about a decade ago right now, and just seeing how it's evolved and iterated in the pathway. But I know as a healthcare platform and one that enables a lot of hospitals and healthcare networks in terms of how they manage uh, medical records and how they operate, you know, how how did they or how did you support them in understanding the cultural nuances within the Middle East and within the UK? And what are some ways that other leaders could sort of cross that chasm?
Yeah, I've been working with League for 6 months almost in terms of that international expansion story, and I think the relevance being that the first set of expansion markets very much overlaps with either places where I've lived or worked. The UK being one of them, and this is where I've been, and this is where I had my previous experience working at Lyra Health, the leading mental health tech player. And so the support here is around understanding the local context. Especially, we are developing a service offering that trying to sell into the NHS, for example, and different NHS trusts. And I've spent a lot of time in the last year, especially working with startups in an advisory capacity around how to, what is your entry pathway to the NHS. It's a mammoth of an organization, but it's actually a lot more decentralized than people think, and it can be quite a lengthy process to approach. There's multiple stakeholders on hand. Selling into government or public sector organizations requires a whole different set of skills and ways of demonstrating value creation from a population health management perspective. And so it's kind of trying to understand or bridge that gap of a league has had a great run of 10 years of success in North America, in the US and Canada, but translating that to what does this mean in a UK context, and into different stakeholders is something that I've been able to help with. In the Middle East, obviously, there's the cultural awareness around how deals get done, stakeholder management, timeline expectations. I think one of the biggest areas where I have to spend a lot of time bridging cultures, or bridging different time zones or so, is around how time is managed in meetings, and expectations around deadlines, and in the sales cycle. So, for example, if there's a solution sales cycle that takes 6 to 9 months in North America, I say in the Middle East, at least if you are starting with your first couple of customers, that needs to be doubled right away. It will take time. It's a very relationship-based a region. You have to build trust. And a lot of time, those meetings and engagements can come across in a North American context like they're wasted time, where you're not accomplishing anything on your set agenda. But it's very important because it's building that trust around the individuals sitting across on the table, not just the name of the organization. So it's kind of that translational experience of feeding back from previous, jobs or deals I've done in different regions, from my own personal engagements with individuals. I've been very lucky to have been part of, have done my MBA at Harvard Business School that had a big international community of accomplished leaders, and being able to learn from their experiences doing work in different countries. As I mentioned, grew up in Saudi Arabia as an expat, which I think was a great learning for me around growing up in a very diverse setting and seeing people from different backgrounds, learning how do people celebrate, how do they mourn, how do they perceive time, and how does that then translate into a business context.
Yeah, so it sounds like, what's really, really important. There's a number of key layers here. One is to, I think, have representation, have the cultural representation, have individuals that are part of the team that truly understands the culture and understands as well the nuances of the industries, how work happens, how the sales cycles operate, um, uh, and and then just really building on that understanding. There's almost like a building a map of really being attuned to not only the industries and the way organizations are structured, but also the human side of things, right? The how do you build relationships? How do you build trust? What are the timelines? Um, and I think that's why it's just so interesting to see how your role comes in as like a guide almost in a sense to look at, well, this is what you can expect, and this is how you work within these organizations, and we can explore and learn more of this, but that can really expedite, that cultural representation within organizations can vastly expedite how we take an empathetic stance and really start understanding other cultures. And I think I'm interested from your perspective. Here I wanted to explore this sort of practical sense, like how do you do this on the ground, right? Operationally. And I think you really shared it so succinctly. But now I'm interested from like a relational perspective. You come into a meeting within a new country, um, a sector that's growing with stakeholders that are there meeting with you as a leader. What are some of the key skills that leaders need to have in those meetings when you're looking to build business in other cultures, in other countries, and you need to attune to that cultural nuance? What are the skills they need? How do they need to show up? You said to slow down, right? And so how do you slow down? Like, what does that look like? I'm interested.
Yeah, I think for me, a key skill set is listening and spending a lot of time trying to absorb not just what's being said, but visual cues and settings, and what does this say around about the context that we're in. I think personally, I like to read a lot of world literature, and I think that's influenced my lens in terms of how I approach doing business in new countries. I sometimes have an understanding of the history of these nations, the different maybe political or macroeconomic issues that are underpinning the current environment that we're in, and trying to understand also things like what's the sports or arts elements that these nations are interested in. Now, given my Middle Eastern background, we spend a lot of time in the beginning, getting to know the individual. As I mentioned, it's a region that historically based its trust on individuals more so than institutions, And so there is this idea that I'm engaging with you as Michael. I'm not. It's not about the institution you're representing. And if you even monitor how business gets done in the region, you'll find that people anchor around individuals and they follow them in different roles. And this may lead to very interesting stories around careers and investments that don't look as linear as they do in a Western context. But what I've taken in from that is the idea of connecting with the individual first, as opposed to coming and saying, okay, this is my title, this is my organization, and being ready to pitch or sell directly. It's kind of listening, understanding who the individual is that I'm sitting across, what are their interest areas, speaking about anything beyond the business context to get into a comfortable rapport before moving forward. And then picking up on hunches from them in terms of, are they very fast paced in do they want to get to action items right away? So this is a person who's very much execution or action oriented. Are they wanting a lot more context? Are they looking to involve much more people in, follow up meetings, or are they looking to engage one on one directly? So it's leaning in to take cues from them about how they want me to show up in that meeting. And I think it all comes back to this idea of a growth mindset. And even with countries or places where I'm very familiar, as I was just saying in Saudi, for example, it's a place that I can say that I'm quite familiar with. I had to pause and digest the changes that are happening on the ground, so that I can show up in a way that is relevant to the current context, because my context, it has been outdated, or it's evolved quite a bit since what I experienced the country like. And I think that's more important nowadays, because there's lots of changes happening on a political environment, in a macroeconomic way, in a technology way. And so, for example, there was skepticism with the advent of AI and LLMs that this would be picked up in the region as quickly. And over there, actually, a lot more people than anticipated have been using LLMs, and they're using them in a voice way. So it's tapped into elders who never typed, or maybe not are illiterate or don't know how to read or write, and yet here they are engaging with a chat GPT or whatnot, and having a conversation about their health, around things in their social setting. And so it's kind of like saying, oh, pause, listen, reflect, and grow with the inputs that you're getting from the environment that you're in.
Wow. I think there's some really practical qualities there that's we can all, I think, reflect on in terms of how we show up. And I think it's just so valuable to take a moment to just acknowledge, like, when interacting with individuals that are from any culture, the value of bringing in essentially an open mindset, an openness to to everything, literally, like, openness to question your own ideas and perspectives around technological adoption, education, cultural norms, because things are changing so rapidly, and we can never know what's happening in people's lives, period. We can anticipate, but having an openness in a lot of these conversations that we're stepping into as leaders in particular can really allow us to see new opportunities and not stifle certain opportunities as well by thinking that things are a certain way. There's also that element of curiosity that I was hearing. Really, and this comes into, I think, that listening, really taking that time to become curious and to learn about um, how people see the world, how they engage in business interactions and in relationship building. Are they more of a collaborative? Do they want action on things right now? Are they really interested in learning more about you and tending to that time to explore that? And I think this is so interesting to think about, like, slowing down. You can do that by taking that time to be curious, to take that time to listen, to slow down by being open, right? Sometimes we get caught up in these fixed mindset of how things should be. And It's interesting. From Harvard University, Ellen Langer. She's actually a business psychologist. She speaks about how mindlessness is using yesterday's business solutions and strategies for today's problems.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's just really showing that if you come in with a fixed mindset, especially right now, it's a bit of a mindless activity, right? And so how can we be mindful and really approach it in the way that you were sharing, I think, Lamia? I think it's so valuable.
Yeah, I'll give you a small anecdote or story that came across my mind. I was in my previous job, I was closing a deal, acquiring a Swiss company, and it was two clinical psychologists by background who are retiring, so they're late 60s, early 70s, and um, and they feel very antagonistic towards the acquisition or the party. Like they knew that the UK entity that I was in at the time was getting acquired by a US player. There was this kind of defensiveness against selling to a US player, data privacy, what's going to happen to the employees, etc. And I was thrown into this deal after my predecessor had worked on it for some time, and says, "Okay, these are two difficult older men. It was still COVID was still ongoing. This was late 2021. They're anti-vaccinations. They're this, like they gave me some context, and here you go." And I showed up when it was around, I think, Christmas time, and I've been in a U.S. context, and I've been, learned to say Happy Holidays and not say Merry Christmas and whatnot. And I know that in continental Europe they still say Merry Christmas, and I went ahead and said, Merry Christmas, and have you guys got any plans for the holidays? And then they went on a whole long, talk around how Christmas has been hijacked, and they had their own views and whatnot, and they said, and you're Egyptian, and what do you know about Christmas? And in an environment like that, I can get very defensive. What I did was again pause and say, okay, I understand the context of how these two individuals may be thinking. They're frustrated by the process. They're an older generation. They speak differently on some topics. So I took it as an educational piece. I said, actually, in Egypt, we have 15% of our population, 10 to 15% is Coptic Christian. They celebrate Christmas on January 7th, and we typically say Merry Christmas. So yes, and Christmas was a big thing growing up in Egypt. And actually, even if you're in a Muslim household, a lot of people still put up a Christmas tree. And then you can see them sort of being surprised around my approach. So I just decided to go slow, not get defensive, and say, this is how I'm going to engage in the interaction. I don't need to be friends with these two individuals beyond the work context, but at the same time, I don't need to fuel it up with more antagonism around identity elements. So that's my personal ethos in these environments.
And so how did it turn out?
Uh, Great. I mean, we closed the transaction, and my previous boss said, if it wasn't for you, I don't think this would have gotten done. They had their stereotypes, around Arabs also not showing up to meetings on time. This was all being done virtual. I was always 2 minutes early, and then in the end they would laugh. They're like, you're sharper than Swiss timing, and so it's around like dispelling stereotypes, and that would make me happy. It's an opportunity for me to show up and represent something different. And I know that people out there have stereotypes about certain backgrounds, ethnicities, gender stereotypes, etc. And I can choose to go in an environment and feel like, my battle shields I'm a warrior in a battle, or I can choose to let those shields down and say, okay, here I am, and I'm going to show you how what my values are and how I want to show up.
What you just shared there, I find really pertinent right now. There's in the US and in Canada, and I would say in a lot of Europe and many parts of the world as well, there's like a lot of polarization happening towards a nationalistic view, this ideal of who that country is, and I think there are these niche groups that are very outspoken about this, but it's also, I think, influencing this worldview of that I need to protect my identity. I think it's coming out a lot by fear. So I need to put this shield up to uh, hold true to what I feel is right, to my ideal of what this value is to be in this country and to be who I am. And a bit of a and actually not a bit of a lot of pushback towards even taking that moment to consider another person's view and to take that empathetic stance like what you've shared and drop those shield. What what are we losing with that type of approach? What are the ramifications of that? What is the blowback from the downside of that type of approach when it comes to working across borders and just in general right now from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, I mean, this topic that you've opened is one that is top of mind for me. Obviously, I moved to the UK 4 years ago. Interestingly, as an Egyptian living in Saudi Arabia or growing up there, we're referred to as expats. Now, in the north, in a Western context, I'm lumped under the immigrant title, and there's a lot of connotations that come around with that in terms, and there's stereotypes again around what does an immigrant look like, what is their educational level, how are they contributing to the society? And in the UK, there were just some big demonstrations happening 2 weekends ago that, to be honest, had us take a step back and say, what's going on here? And I always try to, I think I always like to try to do perspective taking or step into another person's shoes. My opinion is that when macroeconomic environments are difficult, people tend to get more scared, and then they are worried about their livelihood. They're worried about their jobs. They start becoming more anxious, and they're trying to create stories around with explanations around what's going on. And unfortunately, I find that the political scene has been a letdown in the sense that politicians are playing more into these insecurities and fears by bifurcating people that on the ground could be a lot closer and stand to benefit a lot more from each other. For me, diversity and inclusion is a key value, even before way before it became an acronym and had a whole global launch. Because I grew up as a child, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I went to a British school. I had friends from different countries. We celebrated different religious holidays, and so it was a very inclusive environment. And I think having experienced it, I think it's a great privilege, having gone through that as a child, where that's become part of my formative period, where that's become part of my character. So it's really shaped up the idea of I'm going to try to interact with every individual, understanding that we, at the bottom of it, have a lot more commonalities with each other than we have differences. And if somebody's feeling defensive about these differences, then I'm trying to understand where they're coming from. Some people I'll be able to engage with, others not. But I in person have taken a step back from social media in the last 6 months because I realized that living in the minority in the UK and seeing this discourse happening is going to make me question my existence here, and it's going to make me step out into the streets and feel a lot more defensive all the time. And my lived experience is something that's been quite different. I've had a lot of great friendships in the country. It hasn't been a walk in the park in terms of plugging in. It takes a long time. I think my learning has been moving countries as an adult is a lot more difficult than as a child. But my lived experience has been great overall, and I haven't had that kind of starkly divisive experiences that are being brought through from social media. So I think we're losing out on the ability to have a conversation. And I'm always pushing for let's have a conversation. And that doesn't mean me losing my identity or losing who I am authentically. I'm very much a proud Arab. I always say a proud Muslim. I love my heritage. I stepped into a trustee or into a charity that is all about fostering Arab arts and culture in London, because I wanted, and I think arts and culture are the best place to create conversations between people from different backgrounds. And for me, that was my contribution in terms of saying, okay, this is what I want to do for that part of my identity. And I would love to, help bring people more into these spaces in order to understand and hear stories that maybe they're not seeing in the news.
Mm. Yeah, so I'm hearing is that, one of the biggest impacts of this sort of emerging nationalistic, very polarizing mindsets and narratives that are arising within a lot of countries right now, especially Western countries, and within specific subgroups, I would say, of peoples, it's stifling the capacity and opportunity to have a conversation. And um and you know and and when I think about everything you've been sharing around really being able to listen, to be curious, to understand the relationships and how they're built in different countries, the concept of time and how that's approached, and why people have different concepts of time. In Germany and Switzerland, like you're sharing, there is a very regimented ideal of time. And in other countries, it's the time is focused more on relationship building because there's the need of trust, right? If I'm going to be in this relationship over a longer period of time, I need to trust you, so I'm going to spend more time building this relationships, and the values are associated differently. And if we can't have those conversations, we're not going to gain those cultural nuances, and we're going to come up to barriers of understanding, barriers of empathy, feeling safe, feeling a sense of trust. And ultimately, we're going to lose opportunities, I think, based on what I was hearing on some of those key things that we need as leaders during this time, is to foster that sense of dialogue, foster that sense of openness, curiosity, the capacity to listen. There's just so much there. AI has come up a little bit in our conversations here, and you shared something around how you noticed in Saudi Arabia, how you recently traveled over there, that there's just been a massive transformation. You've got many more women leaders in tech present and at the table talking. The organization League that you're a part of right now, AI is an integral part of their strategy in healthcare. Recently, I actually read an article around specifically in Muslim countries, that I've heard that there has been a rapid uptake of AI in particular, and specifically condoned by the spiritual leaders. I found that fascinating because they said, "Hey, AI can answer questions very close to our elders, the elder spiritual leaders and elders that are within communities." And so we condone the use of AI to as a complement towards the elders and spiritual leaders across the countries. And when I heard that, I was like, wow, this is amazing. The speed of uptake, and also the democratization of information could be so much faster here, now that there's actually religious leaders supporting, the usage of technology that, you know, provides you a lot more information than we've ever had. So I'm interested from your perspective, that's just sort of flavoring that, and I think maybe just exploring what you were sharing, how I can see how that adoption is happening, maybe with a little bit of what I heard there. But when you look at AI now, and the role that it's playing in healthcare internationally, um, from your perspective, what are some considerations that leaders need to have to balance innovation, but also with sort of equity and representation and data sets? Because that information, it may not be representative of all cultures. It may not be, actually, it isn't. And so, in the research, like even research, you look at much of Western research is done on white Caucasian university students. And so, like, how do we, what are some considerations that are needed from an AI in healthcare and as it advances from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I think from I think there's a move with lots of countries to have sort of sovereign AI offerings or national offerings. When we were in Saudi, we met with a newly established company called Humane that has received a lot of funding from the Saudi government and has established the first Arabic LLM that is not just responding to you in Arabic, but it's picked up on different regional dialects and a lot more of that local context, which is a lot more further along than any of the other Western LLMs in place. And there's a big focus in the region, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in parts of Europe and in China, obviously, where every country feels they need to have at least a sovereign offering, especially for areas like healthcare or defense, or for other areas where that reliance on a Western solution offering is not going to be the best. I think that's one thing. I think in the healthcare context, it's there's a lot of hype around AI, and I think that hype is starting to phase out a little bit in the sense that there's research now showing that a lot of companies have invested in AI solutions and offerings, but really they haven't seen that ROI pan out, and that a lot of that is coming out of change management issues, and it's really comes back to the employees and the individuals understanding how to incorporate AI offerings into workflows, not just as a sort of as a point of, a one point solution offering. And I think in healthcare, especially, what a lot of clinicians and what a lot of specialists in the field have been saying is great to come out with AI roadmaps and solution or service offerings, but we always have to present how is this making the life of the patient easier? How is this making the life of the clinician easier? Is it an added layer of complexity actually in terms of data inputs and whatnot, or is it removing administrative burden? And how is that ultimately making the patient journey shorter, easier, improving health outcomes, etc. So the idea of AI just for the sake of AI, I think is fast changing, and that's a lot of the conversations that we're in now. League has got a very robust product roadmap for AI with a lot of agentic AI solutions coming out to address these areas. Now, what we're hearing from the ground, especially in countries like Saudi, is that there is a big interest in terms of co-development of solution offerings, especially from some of the sovereign AI entities that I was referencing. There's this idea, at least in the region, of we don't just want to have this reliance on Western technology and be resellers and market. We want to co-develop and we want to be a key stakeholder in the inputs and the process of developing those algorithms and developing those models in order to ensure there is sufficient representation of backgrounds and ethnicities and local population data. And I think it's great that countries are doing this more and more. I'm personally very passionate about representation in the AI space. I've attended quite a few parliamentary debates in the UK, roundtables around ethical AI and representation, especially in healthcare. And until now, what's found is there is very little representation of women's health data in these models, of ethnic minority groups. And as you're saying, a lot of the research historically has been done on a cohort of individuals that may not be representative of the wider population. And with the way that information is being surfaced, if you're not well versed in these spaces, you're not privy to these limitations of the data, and so you're kind of relying on outputs that are not necessarily in the best interest of what your profile is. So there is a lot of projects that are working on expanding that representation, making sure that these data points are in the Middle East, for example, because I'm interested in the areas of longevity and also genomic studies. There is a big interest in the area of genomics because there's been historically a lot of hereditary diseases due to tribal intermarriages within the same sort of extended families. And now governments are realizing that they want to create more of an awareness campaigns for the population, but also equip people with the risk stratification and profiling based on their genetic backgrounds and tie this into predisposition to some diseases. And so again, a lot of the genomics in the UK, for example, has historically been having one of the biggest genomics data banks in the world, but it hasn't yet been translated into a sort of an offering for the end patient. And in my opinion, that's been because of sort of a decentralized data platforms. They're now working within the NHS for a federated data platform to combine everything into one, and multiple stakeholders, that it's difficult to kind of combine all of your medical records, the genomics data, etc., to come out with something that is meaningful for the patient. In the Gulf region, whether it's the UAE or Saudi, they're leapfrogging that because they have this centralized decision making. They have these centralized data systems already, so they're able to think through go to market approaches and how to come up with products and offerings for the end patient or citizen that is more meaningful faster. So I find that very interesting. They have big programs now in some of the local universities around genetic mapping of the tribes and individuals within the region that are coming up with a lot of sort of nuances around this genetic mapping that is quite different to a Western cohort, for example, and that may have implications for certain diseases, or that may impact the population. So I think this area is fascinating. It calls for much more collaboration, whether it's public-private partnerships or whether it's across countries, in order to develop a broader a set of data that could be more representative.
Mm, fascinating. Yeah, it's just, just especially hearing representative data sets and really consolidating by region information that could be really tailored specifically to um, the people in that region. I think it's fascinating, and just seeing how AI and its adoption and the innovations off of it are evolving globally. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'd love to take it now, just maybe as we come to the tail end here of our time together, just bringing it to sort of your own experience. How has your upbringing growing up in Saudi Arabia, attending a British school, later working across the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, how has that shaped your ability to adapt, observe, and build trust? It seems like this is something that's quite comes naturally to you. And so how has that experience informed how you show up?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think I'm been extremely privileged to have grown up in this environment whereby I was able to receive, a great Western education with going to a British school, but at the same time, growing up, it's what they would call compounds or gated communities, whereby it was mostly made for expats because at the time, the country was a lot more closed. You had to be more fully covered up going out and about. Women couldn't drive easily or so. And then within these gated communities, you could experience life like you would in a different country. As a child, that didn't feel very, very limiting to me. I've often gone back as a working woman or working adult and gone back to my mother and said, my hats off to you for putting up with that, because she was a working woman until we moved to Saudi for my father's work. And and she had to give up that, and I didn't think that I could have made this trade-off or compromise, so I was very appreciative for her. But essentially, I think it's about being in an environment where learning was happening with people from different backgrounds, sharing stories of their own upbringing, how their families are like, as I mentioned, how they celebrate, how they do things, their food, their cuisine, tasting that early on, and having this international palate, and being open to these experiences, I think was greatly fascinating. And I was also sometimes the experience of living in the GCC as an expat, people tend to isolate themselves from the local population. I've always had an interest in mingling with and interacting with the local population as much as possible, and sort of enriching myself with those experiences. And some of the concepts I saw in play in Saudi growing up, I very much loved, and I've tried to continue with. And some of these, there's two concepts that they have. It's across the Middle East, but it's more rampant in the GCC. They have this idea of a majlis, which is essentially like a forum where people. I think it still happens in a segregated way, but it's essentially a big open space with couches where, for example, the men would get together and they would discuss different topics happening in the society or in the business world, and they would hear from each other, and that would inform their decisions around certain topics. This was also happening in female forums around topics that are of relevance to a female audience, and I managed to sit in some of those, and I was always fascinated by the idea of that, bringing people from different backgrounds, experiences, listening to stories, and it's an area that its whole history has been storytelling and poetry and orator's land, as they say. So the idea of that narrative building and what story are we saying is was very much lived and practiced. And these forums would then be coupled with poetry recitations or some music playing at the end of the session. And I've tried to continue this on in terms of always gathering around the table with, whether it's a group of friends, a group of colleagues or acquaintances, and discussing and debating different topics from politics to business to trends in the society, and learning and being informed by that. It's also a region where I learned that leadership is not necessarily about your title. Like, you can lead by example and lead by humility. I think that's one thing that's, in terms of my own personal values, very important. And coming back, I think, to the when we spoke about the growth mindset, one of the things that I've observed is in to have that and to be in an environment where you're able to have the fluidity of dealing in different contexts. It needs to be you need to lower your ego a lot, and realize that you may not always have the answer. You may not always be the person calling the shots, but you're absorbing and digesting, and that is informing your opinion or your strategy. Whereby you may not be speaking the most at a table, but when you do speak, it's an informed decision or an informed opinion that is able to move the needle. And I think that's quite interesting and a bit different to Western models of leadership. When I was at Harvard, certainly, or more in an American context, it was clear to me that the setup was rewarding more the individuals who speak up more and who speak up with more conviction and authority. And that's a very different lens to what I'd experienced growing up. And it always takes a bit of adaptation, even until now. I go into many meetings, and for the first meeting, at least, I may not say a word or two, but I'm kind of, taking in a lot of the cues that we were talking about, and then trying to do a mental model of, what is this telling me? How does this fit in with things that I already know? And what gaps may I have that I'm not aware of in this context that I want to pull in more information or data on. So I think that's there are these concepts that I experienced as a child that I've been trying to take with me in different ways. I mean, I think even we were saying earlier about the trip on the ground is about spending more time in person with individuals. I obviously, appreciate a lot the virtual. This wouldn't be possible if we weren't having the tools that allow for virtual connection. But I also come from a culture that values very much that in-person interaction, because it gives you a true sense that what we always say culturally is it gives you a true sense of how a person is really doing or faring. And so when I say, how are you doing? It's not just good, great, and it's like a dismissive question. I think when we say, how are you doing? We really mean, like, you're kind of doing a mental check-in with how are you feeling? How's your health? How's your mindset? And then and it's a safe space to sort of talk about that. So I try to be building bridges, or I think a sort of a connector across cultures is how I would love to continue to be described.
Oh, that's just so rich. There's so much that we can learn from those insights and that experience that you've had. And I love how you've shared it as practical ways that you've integrated this into your life. You know, these experiences that you've had, experiencing different cultures, experiencing different ways that um, cultures interact with each other, engage with each other, and in particular, you know, in Saudi Arabia, the forums and how that lives on within you, and then also the leadership values and seeing how you can show up as a leader in different ways. And I love that, you know, the value of humility and checking your ego and how important that is in how you show up and the impact that you have on others. And also, you know, bringing back this sense of, you know, there's this speed that we have, I think. There's a sense of that there's this pace that we're all living right now. And I think especially those in leadership positions where it can feel really hard to slow down, but, you know, to slow down and just connect with like, how are you doing? You know, and but to really listen to that and to think about it in terms of like how are you like, how's your mindset? You know, how are you feeling today? You know, and just really coming from that deeper sense of human connection, which is something that very clearly experienced in your upbringing. And I'm so glad that we can bring this into here. And so my final question will be just if a leader is listening today and they want to develop greater fluency and resilience, a cultural fluency and resilience across cultures, where would you say they should begin?
I think for me, at least personally, what's worked really well for me is immersing myself into more of the arts and culture world. Whether it's about reading literature from different countries, watching movies, or immersing myself in stories that are coming out from different countries and regions, in order to familiarize myself with the societal construct, gender. How does gender show up in this country or region? What are the household issues? What does the political environment look like? How are relationships best fostered? I spent, for example, I've never worked actively in the area of, for example, South Korea or Japan. We were looking to close a deal in Japan in my previous company. We spent, I think, a good 3 months with a cultural advisor just to understand how to navigate the Japanese market. What would a visit on the ground entail? Um, Gifting culture, exchange of business cards, how to, the hierarchy understanding, and what kind of delegation needs to show up on the ground. And I was, we worked with an advisor just to make sure that we got it right. But I felt like I was able to ask the right questions because I'd also read a lot of Japanese literature and had watched some movies in that space. So I kind of understood a bit what matters in that context. And I think that also provides insights into what are the areas that they're interested in terms of sports, arts, local brands. It provides you the conversational context in which when you meet somebody for the first time and in one of these meetings, you're able to say, oh, I know so and so. Like when I went for my MBA, in Saudi I was exposed to a lot of US products and things, and I would say, oh, I know, Dr. Pepper's was was a big. It wasn't even available in other parts of the Middle East, and or I knew all of the department stores. And my American friends would be like, "Oh, how do you know these?" And I said, "From the movies and the shows. It is a soft power, and you're able to feel like you've walked these streets or you've seen these logos or brands before, and you're able to understand what it means for the individual from that place." So for me, I always love. I'm not an artist by background, but I love appreciating the arts and seeing how I can bring that in to the business context. I say nowadays we live in a time where unfortunately, the politics and diplomacy don't exist in a way that we can model. So I see roles that people play opening up business opportunities across borders as being sort of the new wave of diplomats or so that when I was growing up we used to learn a lot around negotiation, and so from political figures and from diplomacy. I find that nowadays that kind of role modeling doesn't exist in the same way, and I find that individuals working within multinational organizations or doing cross-border work, are able to navigate these environments in a way that may have some bigger learning beyond that.
Well, you may not be an artist in some of the conventional ways, but you definitely have brought us the art and science of cultural fluency and cultural adaptability from a leadership perspective. And I am so grateful for that. And so, finally, where can our listeners connect with you and follow your work?
You can find me on LinkedIn. It's Lamiaa Soliman, and I started a Substack recently. I haven't been as active, but I'm interested in areas, especially if you want to speak around healthcare, longevity, cross cultural engagements. I'm more than happy to do that. And what I'm hoping to do also, in when I find the time, is to write more around Arab leadership examples and business learnings, so that people can understand that there are different models to operate. We don't need to always rely on Western leadership models, and the two can also converge and create something that can be beneficial to all parties.
Fantastic. Well, we will definitely put those links as well for the LinkedIn and Substack into the description of this episode. Thank you again so much, Lamia, for sharing your experiences and insights. There's just so much that I'm going to take away already. I'm just noticing how much we've revealed, literally, and how I'm going to show up now as well as I step into, we're a global organization too. So I'm really looking forward to putting these principles into play. So thank you again. Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to staying connected. And I love what you're doing, and I think it's much needed in our current environment.
Thank you. This brings us to the end of another episode of Leading Minds Revealed. Thank you to all of you, our listeners, for joining us. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe, share the episode, and I'll see you on the next one.
Leading Minds Revealed podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.